Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jordan here. So I wanted to make a video. I know most everybody always asks what lenses should you get. So I would say probably the most common lens that I would recommend to anybody that's looking to step away from maybe like the kit lens would be one of these, the Canon 50mm lenses. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, first off, I want to say the main differences between these two. So this one is the cheaper f1.8 lens, and this is the more expensive f1.4 lens. So in comparison, you're looking at $126 new plus tax, or you're looking at $400 plus tax. Now that's up to you if you have the budget to spend on this one or this one. I mean, that's, you know, personal preference, whatever you can afford. Now, I have seen these refurbished on Canon's website for about $85. This one refurbished on Canon's website is about $272. You probably could also find these a little bit less expensive, maybe on like a Facebook Marketplace or eBay. So that's something to consider as well. I purchased this one from Canon refurbished, and I purchased this one from the Facebook Marketplace. I'll get into this one here in a little bit when I kind of break everything down, but there is a problem with this one, and I'll kind of give you guys a heads up on what to look for if you do purchase a used lens locally from somebody. All right, this is going to be the autofocus test. I forgot to mention this to you guys earlier. So when I purchased this f1.8 lens from the other local photographer near me, I didn't really know what I was looking for to begin with. And so there is this noise problem, which I'm pretty sure is some sort of a diaphragm that uses to autofocus inside of the lens, makes this noise. Now, both of these have autofocus. The autofocus on this one uses the STM motors, the step motors, and this is an ultrasonic motor. So this one is a lot quieter, especially for like video when it's autofocusing. This one is a little bit louder, and I will say that as far as the focusing motor on this guy goes, you definitely hear it. It has this kind of almost like robotic, like twitchy noise to it. So like when it auto focuses, it shifts and twists, and you notice it a little bit more. I don't ever really use autofocus for video that often, so I can't say that I really have a problem with it. Especially just doing these talking head shots. When I do like B-roll and stuff, I basically just manual focus it, and I don't really ever have a problem. So something to consider if you're looking for a lens to use for autofocus on video. This might not be the best option, but something to consider. So between the two, you get an f1.8 aperture and an f1.4 aperture. So the difference in light isn't a huge step. I mean, you're probably getting close to, I would say, almost a one full stop of extra light with the f1.4 compared to the f1.8. But I mean, in situations where it's low light, the f1.8 still shines. So in situations where there's really low light, the f1.8 still shines. I mean, it's not a terrible lens by any means, especially for the price. Now, if you're looking to get into like really low light photography, you get the Canon L series 50mm lens. That's $1,300, I think, for an f1.2, which is pretty, I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, but is it really worth it to go from a $400 lens to a $1,300 lens? Maybe, Probably not. I would say, I mean, unless you're just really trying to get like the best glass possible, I would think that there's probably some other lenses like Sigma or Tamron that offer a 1.2 for $700 to $900, somewhere in that ballpark. So just something to consider. Now, the nice thing with both of these is they are both capable of working with the full frame DSLR bodies that Canon offers. As far as full frame mirrorless, you would probably have to get an adapter to use those on a full frame mirrorless camera. But if you have, let's say, like a 5DX Mark IV or 2, 3, or the 60s, basically any of Canon's full frame DSLR lineup, you can basically pop these on without any sort of adapter, which is nice. Now, the one advantage that the f1.4 has, which, I mean, if you guys have watched any other reviews or tutorials on the f1.4, is it has a full-time manual focus. So basically, even if you're in autofocus and your camera is autofocusing, so you can still use the focusing ring to focus the lens itself manually, even when it's in autofocus, which is a little sketchy at first, but I mean, it's something that you get used to. It's actually kind of nice, especially if you're autofocusing and it doesn't really hit the autofocus exactly where you want it, and then you can just kind of like back it up a hair, which is nice. So both of these are great portrait lenses. So on the APS-C size sensors, you're getting equivalently an 80mm lens, which is still really good for portraits. For full frame, you're getting in a 50mm lens, which is still a really good portrait lens. So between the two, I mean, you can use these either or for portraits, either on APS-C size sensors or full frame. It doesn't necessarily matter. You're just going to have to kind of position yourself back just a little further with a crop sensor camera than you would on a full frame. So a downside to both of these is that there is no image stabilization. So if you are shooting in a low light situation where, let's say, your shutter speed is at 1/40th of a second, you're at ISO 1600, your aperture is like an f1.4 or an f1.8. There is no image stabilization, so you're really going to have to be careful. Even if you have to bump your ISO up, or maybe your shutter speed down just a hair, depending on how fast you can shoot with your shutter speed. I've noticed myself personally, I can hold the camera and shoot at probably like a 1/50th, 1/40th of a second handheld and still get some pretty decent images. So keep that in mind. Maybe just practice shooting at like 1/40th of a second handheld just to kind of get that shake out of your hand, and maybe you're going to be good to go. There's just something, things to keep in mind. Now, another disadvantage to both of these, so the f1.8 has a 49mm thread on the front, so if you're trying to use ND filters or polarizing filters, you're probably either going to have to buy a step down ring, which I highly suggest buying a step down ring before you go out and purchase an entirely new set or an entire new ND or polarizing filter. Step down rings or step up rings are super cheap. They're inexpensive. They're maybe $10 or so, maybe $12 shipped. They're relatively inexpensive. You can pretty much use them on any lens that has a 49mm thread or 52, yada yada, depending on what size. This is a 58mm thread, so when I first bought my ND filters, I bought all of my ND filters with a 58mm thread, because this lens, my 75-300 and my 18-55 kit lens all have a 58mm thread for ND filters. And so I basically just stuck with that, just purchasing 58mm and then using a step down or a step up ring to go from there. So the 50mm f1.4 lens does have the slight advantage in low light situations. It's very minute. I would say that probably you're not going to really notice it a whole lot, but that's up to you to decide. I will do some side-by-side comparisons on both of these two, so just keep that in mind. Now, one last thing I will say about the 50mm lenses, while they are very good, you will still notice some chromatic aberration in wide open apertures, specifically this one. I don't know what it is with this lens specifically. but you will get chromatic aberration on some of your images, even around like an f2 with it. It's just something to keep in mind. This one's the same thing. I will say, I think just because this element is smaller itself, it doesn't really have as much. I will say that I probably noticed less chromatic aberration from the f1.8 compared to the f1.4, but I digress. So that's basically it, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll answer them to the best of my ability. I mean, is it worth it to spend an extra almost $200 new for the f1.4 as opposed to just buying the f1.8 lens? I would say it depends, because number one, it depends on what you're using it for. Let's say you just want a 50mm lens to do like some videos and stuff with. I would say probably pick this one up. It's still a very sharp lens, especially probably at around an f2.2. If you plan on purchasing this lens itself, there's a few nuances. I've used this lens, I've put it on a gimbal, and the lens, the barrel shaft itself of the lens, it's really thick, and so you might have to use like some sort of a razor plate or a riser plate on the gimbal itself, just so the focusing ring doesn't hit the gimbal itself. This one I have no issues with. Like I said, the motors on this are a lot quieter than this one is, so might be something to consider this one instead, unless you absolutely need the better performance in low light with this f1.4. Just something to keep in mind. I will say that this lens itself is probably definitely sharper out of the box than this f1.8, so the f1.4, I mean, if you're just looking to get into like portraits and stuff, probably want to pick this one up instead. This is a good option if you don't have the budget for this and you just want to start shooting. So keep it in mind. It's really just something that you kind of like have to take into consideration. I mean, if you have the budget for this, go for it. If you don't, this is perfectly fine. As far as the bokeh goes, they're both really good. You get a little bit better bokeh out of this one just because it's an f1.4. But I mean, at f1.4, it's still going to be kind of softer on the edges, so keep it in mind. You don't always have to shoot at f1.4, but you do get a little bit of a light advantage with this f1.4. So take it as it is. Take it as it is. If you guys like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, also give it a thumbs up. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit all the buttons, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.